Case 1. Jerome Henry Brudos. Jerome Henry Brudos did not look like a monster. To neighbors in Salem, Oregon, he was a quiet electrician, a married father of 2 who kept to himself and lived an unremarkable life. But behind the closed doors of his suburban home, Brudos was living inside a violent fantasy that had been growing since childhood. By the time police uncovered the truth in 1969, investigators would describe him as one of the most disturbing lust killers in American history, a man driven by obsession, hatred, and a fixation on women's bodies that would end at least 3 young lives, and possibly more. Brudos was born on January 31st, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota, into a family dynamic that would leave lasting psychological scars. His mother had desperately wanted a daughter and openly resented the fact that Jerome was a boy. She dressed him in girls' clothing, belittled him, and made him feel unwanted from an early age. Psychologists would later point to this relationship as a foundational element in his rage toward women. By the age of 5, Brudos had developed a sexual fixation on women's shoes, especially high heels, an obsession that would only intensify with time. As a teenager, his behavior escalated from fantasy to action. Brudos began stalking women in his neighborhood, attacking them from behind, choking them unconscious, and fleeing with their shoes. These early assaults brought him in and out of psychiatric treatment and state hospitals. At one point, he dug a pit and attempted to keep girls as captives, an act that led to his confinement at the Oregon State Hospital for 9 months. Doctors there documented violent sexual fantasies centered on revenge against women, particularly his mother. Despite these warning signs, Brudos was eventually released back into society. He managed to suppress his impulses long enough to graduate high school, serve briefly in the military, and train as an electronics technician. In 1961, he married and moved with his wife to Oregon, settling into what appeared to be a stable family life. But beneath the surface, the urges never disappeared. Brudos began suffering what he called migraines and blackouts, which he relieved by prowling neighborhoods at night, stealing women's shoes and lingerie. His fantasies were no longer enough, and by the late 1960s, they turned deadly. On January 26, 1968, 19-year-old Linda K. Slauson vanished while selling encyclopedias door to door in a Portland neighborhood where Brudos lived. Her body was never recovered, but Brudos would later confess to killing her and dumping her remains into the Willamette River. Because no physical evidence was found, he was never prosecuted for her death. That same year, the disappearances continued. On November 25, 1968, 23-year-old Jan Susan Whitney vanished after being last seen in Eugene. Her abandoned car was found at a rest stop along Interstate 5, raising fears that a predator was targeting young women across Oregon. In March 1969, 19-year-old Karen Elena Sprinker, an honor student at Oregon State University, disappeared from a downtown Salem parking structure where she was supposed to meet her mother for lunch. Less than a month later, Linda Dawn Say-Lee, 19, vanished while shopping at Portland's Lloyd Center for a birthday gift for her boyfriend. Their disappearances seemed unrelated at first, but investigators would soon discover a chilling connection. On May 10, 1969, a fisherman discovered a body floating in the Long Tom River near Monroe, Oregon. It was Linda Say-Lee. Her body had been weighted down with heavy automobile parts and tied with wire and cord. 2 days later, just 50 feet away, divers recovered the body of Karen Sprinker, also bound and submerged with engine parts. Both women had been strangled. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of law enforcement. A serial killer was operating in the region. A break in the case came after a failed abduction on April 22, 1969, when a 15-year-old girl narrowly escaped a man who tried to force her into a green Volkswagen Carmen Ghia using a fake gun. She later identified Jerome Brudos from a photo lineup. Around the same time, college students reported receiving strange phone calls from a man claiming to be a Vietnam veteran offering study help. Police traced these calls back to Brudos. When authorities searched his home on Center Street in Salem, they found evidence that left even seasoned investigators shaken. Inside the garage were ropes, wire identical to that used on the victims, and photographs of women, some dead, some posed. There were women's clothes, shoe collections, and disturbing trophies, including body parts preserved as keepsakes. Brudos had photographed his victims during and after death, dressed them in lingerie, and used their bodies to act out his fantasies. Confronted with the evidence, Brudos began to confess. He calmly described strangling his victims and dumping their bodies in rivers. On June 27, 1969, just days before his trial was set to begin, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder for the deaths of Karen Sprinker, Linda Sallee, and Jan Whitney. He received 3 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never walk free again. Behind bars, Brudos continued to disturb prison staff. He collected women's shoe catalogs, claiming they replaced pornography for him. Over the decades, he filed numerous appeals and repeatedly requested parole, insisting he had changed. In 1995, the Oregon Parole Board ruled he would never be released. During interviews, Brudos refused to explain why he committed the murders, stating he had no intention of baring his soul to the public. Jerome Henry Brudos died in prison on March 28, 2006, at the age of 67, after decades behind bars. For the families of his victims, his death brought conflicting emotions: relief that the man who destroyed their lives was gone, and sorrow for the futures that were stolen. Brudos left behind no redemption, only a grim legacy studied by psychologists, profilers, and true crime writers as a chilling example of how unchecked obsession and early warning signs can evolve into unimaginable violence. Case 2. Robert Bryant. On a quiet hillside outside McMinnville, Oregon, a manufactured home sat unnoticed for weeks, its windows dark, its driveway empty, and its silence mistaken for privacy. Neighbors assumed the Bryant family was keeping to themselves, perhaps dealing with illness or settling into their new life. No one imagined that inside the home lay one of the most devastating family annihilations in Oregon's history. When deputies finally forced their way inside in early March 2002, they discovered 6 bodies, each killed by a single shotgun blast. By the time the truth emerged, an entire family was gone, and the questions left behind would never be fully answered. Robert Bryant was 37 years old, a self-employed landscaping contractor, a husband, and a father of 4. His wife, Janet Ellen Bryant, also 37, was found dead in the master bedroom. Their children, Clayton, 15, Ethan, 12, Ashley, 10, and Alyssa, 9, were discovered in their beds. Robert's body lay in the living room, the shotgun beside him. Investigators quickly concluded that Robert had murdered his wife and children before taking his own life on or around February 23, 2002. Each victim had been killed at close range. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, and no indication that anyone outside the family had been involved. To those who knew the Bryants casually, the crime seemed incomprehensible. Friends, neighbors, teachers, and business associates described them as quiet, polite, and deeply devoted to one another. The children were well liked at school, described as bright, respectful, and kind. Teachers noticed nothing alarming in their behavior. School officials attempted to contact the family when the children stopped attending classes, but there was no response. At the time, it did not raise immediate concern. Absences during flu season were common, and no one suspected that something horrific had already taken place. The Bryants had arrived in Oregon less than a year earlier, leaving behind their former life in Shingle Springs, California. According to multiple accounts, the move was sudden and fueled by deep personal conflict. Robert and Janet had been longtime members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, but Robert was eventually expelled from the congregation for behavior elders described as incompatible with church teachings. The expulsion, known as disfellowshipping, reportedly extended to the family as well, leaving them isolated from their religious community and estranged from relatives who remained loyal to the church. This separation appeared to cut deeply. Former neighbors in California described the Bryants as increasingly withdrawn in the years before their move. Robert held Bible studies in his home, homeschooled the children for a time, and limited outside interaction. Some relatives reportedly sought custody of the children, a possibility that deeply troubled both Robert and Janet. According to a church elder, legal documents had already been filed by family members attempting to intervene. Fearing the loss of their children, the Bryants packed up and left California, effectively severing ties with extended family and friends. In Oregon, Robert was determined to start over. He aggressively promoted his landscaping business, went door to door offering services, and quickly found work. By all outward appearances, things were improving. The family purchased a 2-acre lot, installed a double-wide mobile home, and spoke openly about plans to build a larger house. Robert was described as polite, hardworking, and optimistic about the future. Business associates recalled him as pleasant and motivated, someone eager to put past difficulties behind him. Financially, the family had recently emerged from bankruptcy, and attorneys involved stated that their debts had largely been resolved. There was no immediate financial crisis that could easily explain what happened next. Despite the appearance of stability, there were subtle signs of isolation. The family lived quietly, rarely socialized, and did almost everything together. Some neighbors noted that the children seemed deeply attached to their father, almost intensely so. Still, no one reported fear or abuse. There were no police calls, no domestic disturbance reports, and no documented history of violence. Investigators would later say that there were no obvious warning signs pointing toward the massacre that was about to occur. The killings themselves were swift and methodical. Investigators believe Robert shot Janet first in the master bedroom. He then moved through the house, entering each child's bedroom while they slept. Each was killed with a single shotgun blast. Finally, Robert returned to the living room and turned the weapon on himself. 4 firearms were recovered from the home, including 2 shotguns, but only one appears to have been used in the murders. 1 shell casing was recovered for each victim, underscoring the deliberate nature of the act. The bodies went undiscovered for weeks. It was only when neighbors became uneasy and approached sheriff's deputies that authorities entered the home. What they found was described as a horrific and unforgettable scene. The community of McMinnville was stunned. Schools brought in grief counselors. Teachers struggled to explain the loss to students who had just weeks earlier shared classrooms with the Bryant children. Friends and neighbors asked the same question over and over again. Why? Investigators were left with theories but no definitive answers. Religious isolation, fear of losing custody, lingering psychological stress, and Robert's apparent sense of persecution all surfaced as possible contributing factors. Yet none fully explained how a man described as mild-mannered and devoted could annihilate his entire family. With Robert dead, there would be no confession, no explanation, and no opportunity to understand his final thoughts. Case 3. Jordan Adam, Criado. On the morning of July 18, 2011, a thin column of black smoke curled out from beneath the eaves of a modest house on West 10th Street in Medford, Oregon. To neighbors, it looked like an ordinary house fire, the kind that happens quietly in working-class neighborhoods and is forgotten by nightfall. Within hours, that assumption would collapse. What firefighters discovered inside would become the deadliest mass homicide in Jackson County history and one of the most disturbing family annihilations in modern Oregon crime. At the center of it all was Jordan Adam Criado, a 51-year-old father who would later insist he was not responsible for the deaths of his children, even as the evidence told a far darker story. Jordan Criado lived in the house with his wife, Tabasha Page Criado, and their 4 children, 7-year-old Elijah, 6-year-old Isaac, 5-year-old Andrew, and 2-year-old Aurora. From the outside, the family appeared strained but intact. Financial problems weighed heavily on the household. Criado had lost steady employment, the family had faced eviction in the past, and all 4 children had special needs. Tabasha, only 30 years old, had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and had recently made it clear to friends and family that she wanted a divorce. Her social media posts revealed growing resentment toward her husband, whom she described as controlling and unbearable. In the early hours of July 18th, Criado reported his wife missing. Police located Tabasha several hours later at a convenience store just blocks away and gave her a ride home. Surveillance footage showed her calm and composed, showing no visible fear. Officers later said the couple spoke briefly outside the house and that nothing about the interaction suggested imminent danger. Less than 2 hours later, the house was filled with smoke and 5 people were dying inside. At 9:23 a.m., a neighbor noticed smoke seeping from the home and called 911. Police arrived first, but were unable to enter due to heavy smoke. Firefighters forced their way inside moments later. The front door was deadbolted shut, blocked by a burning couch, while the back sliding door had been jammed with a wooden dowel. Inside, fires had been set in multiple rooms. In the master bedroom, responders found the entire family. The scene was chaotic, bloody, and immediately horrifying. Firefighters began pulling victims out one by one, laying them on the front lawn as medics worked desperately to revive them. Tabasha and all 4 children were unresponsive. Some of the children showed faint signs of life at first, but hope faded quickly. Despite a massive emergency response involving dozens of first responders, all 5 were pronounced dead at local hospitals. Jordan Criado was the only survivor, found unconscious inside the house with severe smoke inhalation and cuts to his wrists. He was rushed to the hospital and remained in a coma for nearly 3 weeks. As investigators pieced together what had happened, the evidence painted a chilling picture. Autopsy reports showed that Tabasha had been stabbed 14 times, twice in the face, twice in the neck, and 10 times in the abdomen. There were no signs of a struggle, suggesting she had been attacked by surprise. 2 of the children, Isaac and Andrew, had stab wounds to their necks, while the others showed signs of smothering. All 4 children died primarily from smoke inhalation, meaning they were still alive when the fires were set. Prosecutors later revealed that Criado had given the children large doses of melatonin to make them sleep. After killing his wife, he went from room to room, killing each child in turn. He then carried their bodies into the master bedroom, placing 2 on the bed and 2 on a mattress on the floor beside their mother. Cooking oil was splashed on the walls and on the bodies to accelerate the fire. Multiple fires were ignited throughout the house before Criado attempted to take his own life by cutting his wrists and remaining inside the burning home. When Criado regained consciousness, he offered a different version of events. He claimed that his wife had killed the children and that he stabbed her in retaliation. He said Tabasha had told him she believed she had been drugged after spending the night with another man, and that something about her behavior felt wrong. According to Criado, he stepped outside to work on a car, then returned to find the house in flames and his wife standing over their dead children with a knife. Investigators found this story completely inconsistent with the physical evidence. The knife used to kill Tabasha was found placed neatly on a bunk bed in the children's room. Blood patterns, fire origins, and toxicology reports all contradicted Criado's claims. Jackson County Circuit Judge Lorenzo Mejia would later describe Criado as delusional, telling him that his refusal to accept responsibility dishonored the memory of his children. Prosecutors described the evidence as overwhelming and methodical, leaving no doubt that Criado alone committed the murders. Criado's past added another disturbing layer. He was a registered sex offender who had previously served time in California for molesting his first wife's daughters. Tabasha's family had strongly opposed the marriage, and her father later stated that Criado had not been rehabilitated, but released back into society without adequate safeguards. Friends reported frequent arguments between the couple, though neighbors also recalled seeing Criado playing with the children in the yard, an image that would later haunt the community. In March 2013, Criado entered Alford Place to 5 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of arson, meaning he did not admit guilt, but acknowledged that the evidence would likely lead to conviction. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. At sentencing, Criado sobbed in court, repeatedly referring to his children as "my babies," while continuing to deny responsibility for their deaths. The judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for arson. Case 4. Jeffrey Paul Cutlip. Jeffrey Paul Cutlip's story is one of the most disturbing examples of how violent predators can hide in plain sight for decades, leaving behind unanswered questions, broken families, and silent victims whose voices were only heard many years later. For nearly 40 years, 3 murders in Oregon remained unresolved, scattered across different decades and circumstances, until a single phone call from Texas finally connected them all and exposed the dark path of a man who had lived much of his life drifting between prison cells, parole violations, and the margins of society. This is the story of Jeffrey Cutlip, a serial killer whose crimes spanned generations and whose confession arrived long after the damage was done. Cutlip was born in 1949 and spent most of his adult life entangled with the criminal justice system. By the early 1980s, he had already been convicted of serious sexual offenses, including sodomy and burglary, crimes that involved breaking into a woman's home, tying her up, and holding her captive for hours. These convictions earned him the label of a predatory sex offender in Oregon, a designation that followed him for decades. Psychological evaluations described him as manipulative, emotionally shallow, lacking empathy, and living a parasitic lifestyle. Despite these warnings, Cutlip repeatedly cycled in and out of prison, slipping through gaps in supervision, crossing state lines, and evading consistent monitoring. The first known murder attributed to Cutlip occurred in 1975 in downtown Portland. Marlene Claire Carlson, a 44-year-old mother of 3, lived in the same apartment building as Cutlip. When neighbors realized they had not seen her for over a week, police entered her apartment and found a horrifying scene. Carlson had been bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death. A padlock had been placed on the outside of her door, as if to seal the crime away from discovery. Cutlip lived just down the hall, yet at the time, he was never seriously questioned, and the case eventually went cold, leaving Carlson's family without answers. 2 years later, in 1977, another tragedy struck. 15-year-old Julie Marie Bennett was found dead in Johnson Creek. Her death was ruled an accidental drowning, a conclusion that never sat right with her family. Julie was a shy teenager, but she was also a strong swimmer, taught from a young age by a mother who worked as a lifeguard. The family suspected foul play, especially because Julie had last been seen talking to Jeffrey Cutlip, who was sitting in a park playing his guitar. Still, the cold water destroyed potential evidence, and without proof, the case remained officially closed as an accident for decades. The third murder took place much later, in 1993. Nilena Loribel Dahl, a 33-year-old woman from Spokane, met Cutlip at a bar in Portland. What happened afterward ended her life. Her body was later found in a rural area of Clackamas County. Like the earlier cases, there were suspicions, but no arrest. Once again, Cutlip faded into the background, continuing his pattern of parole violations, unreported moves, and brief incarcerations. For years, detectives carried these cases with them, especially the death of Julie Bennett. In 2008, cold case investigators revisited her file at the request of her family. Detective Jim Lawrence kept her case front and center on his desk, convinced that the truth had never fully surfaced. Investigators also noticed connections to Marlene Carlson's murder, including Cutlip's proximity to her apartment at the time. Yet suspicion alone was not enough to make an arrest, and the evidence simply was not there. Everything changed in July 2012. Living in Brownsville, Texas, Cutlip called 911 and told the dispatcher he wanted to turn himself in. He said he needed to talk to police about some bad things he had done in the past. Detectives were stunned. When Portland investigators flew to Texas, Cutlip began confessing in detail. He admitted to killing Marlene Carlson in 1975, describing how he strangled her with a phone cord and sexually assaulted her after death. He confessed to drowning Julie Bennett in 1977, a revelation that finally confirmed her family's long-held belief that her death was not an accident. He also admitted to killing Nilena Dahl in 1993 after meeting her at a bar. According to police, Cutlip described his motive as sexual gratification. Detectives testified that he enjoyed tying up his victims and, in 2 cases, engaging in necrophilia. His confessions matched details that had never been released publicly, convincing investigators they were finally hearing the truth. For the families, the phone calls informing them of the confession were devastating, but also brought a sense of long-awaited closure. Cutlip's reasons for confessing have been debated. During the 911 call, he claimed guilt had been eating away at him and that he feared being exposed. However, detectives suspected a more practical motive. At the time, Texas authorities had cut off his public benefits while he faced charges for failing to register as a sex offender. Investigators believed Cutlip may have turned himself in to ensure food, shelter, and medical care for the rest of his life, trading freedom for certainty. In 2013, Cutlip pleaded guilty to all 3 murders, avoiding the death penalty. During court hearings, he spoke softly, answering questions with brief yes or yeah responses, rarely making eye contact. Relatives of the victims filled the courtroom. At sentencing in January 2014, a judge imposed 3 consecutive life sentences. Family members delivered emotional impact statements, expressing rage, grief, and the pain of lost futures. Julie Bennett's sisters spoke of the life she never had. Marlene Carlson's daughters described the years stolen from them. A letter from Nilena Dahl's daughter revealed the heartbreak of discovering her mother had been murdered just weeks before she tried to find her. Case 5. Kipland. P. Kinkle. Kipland. P. Kinkle, known to friends as Kip, was just 15 years old when he committed a series of acts that would shock a small Oregon community and make national headlines. Born on August 30th, 1982, Kip appeared at first glance to be a typical teenager from Springfield, a working-class town of about 51,000 people. His parents, William and Faith Kinkle, were respected high school teachers, and his older sister was a college cheerleader who had won national honors. Beneath this seemingly ordinary exterior, however, Kip harbored dark and dangerous impulses that would soon erupt into violence that none could have anticipated. On May 20th, 1998, the first act of a tragedy that would leave 4 dead and more than 20 injured began quietly, almost unnoticed, in his suburban home. Kip had been caught with a stolen handgun at school the day before, resulting in suspension and police involvement. Released into his father's custody, his parents had no way of knowing that the events of that evening would be fatal. In a shocking escalation, Kip shot his father, William, in the back of the head while he was at a bar, and later, when his mother returned from work, he fired multiple times at Faith Kinkle. By nightfall, both parents lay dead in their home, victims of their own son. Kip reportedly told friends that, "It's done, it's over," words they would later understand as chilling confirmation of his actions. The following morning, May 21, 1998, Kip drove his parents' car to Thurston High School, arriving just before 8 a.m. He carried a .22 caliber Ruger semi-automatic rifle, a .22 caliber Ruger handgun, a 9mm Glock pistol, several fully loaded ammunition clips, and over 100 rounds of ammunition. Dressed in a cream-colored trench coat, he walked into the school cafeteria, a space crowded with up to 400 students gathered for the usual morning socializing and a farewell ceremony for graduating seniors. Eyewitnesses described the scene in slow-motion horror. Kip raising his rifle from the hip and firing into the crowd. Students dove under tables, others ran for cover, and bullets shattered plate glass windows. Among the chaos, he emptied 51 rounds from his rifle, striking students indiscriminately. Some were critically wounded, and one student, Mikael Nikolausen, 17, died at the scene. Another, Ben Walker, 16, succumbed to his injuries the following day. 19 other students were hit, while 4 more were injured in the frantic escape from the cafeteria. Amid the terror, a moment of heroism occurred. 17-year-old wrestler Jake Riker, despite being shot in the chest and hand, tackled Kip as the teenager attempted to reload. Several other students joined Riker in pinning Kip to the ground until police arrived. While restrained, Kip pleaded with them, reportedly saying, "Please, just shoot me." His calm demeanor and calculated movements revealed a disturbing composure that masked the violence he had just unleashed. Afterward, police followed Kip's suggestion to check his home, where the bodies of his parents were discovered in separate rooms. Alongside the bodies, authorities found 5 sophisticated homemade bombs, 15 inactive devices, detailed bomb-making instructions, and various chemicals capable of creating explosives. Investigators later reported that a homemade device detonated accidentally during the removal of his mother's body, highlighting the danger that lingered even after Kip's arrest. Kip's fascination with weapons and explosives had been known for some time. He had downloaded bomb-making instructions from the internet, constructed homemade bombs, and even bragged about torturing animals. Friends recalled him stuffing lit firecrackers into a cat's mouth and boasting about shooting or harming small animals. His middle school yearbook entry jokingly voted him most likely to start World War III, a prescient label that hinted at the destructive potential lurking behind his freckled, youthful face. Friends and family also reported that Kip had been grounded for minor mischief, including toilet papering a neighbor's house. Yet his darker inclinations went largely unchecked, despite parental interventions. His father, hoping to channel his obsession with firearms into something manageable, purchased multiple guns for him and took him to the range. Anger management counseling was arranged, but these measures proved futile against the trajectory Kip had already set. Kip's actions shocked a community that had never confronted violence on this scale. The notion that a teenager could take the lives of 2 parents and 2 classmates left neighbors, students, and law enforcement struggling for understanding. As details emerged, the horror deepened. The parents had been respected educators, the students victims of random, unprovoked violence, and the weapons and explosives Kip had accumulated reflected an unsettling premeditation. Media coverage at the time highlighted not just the massacre, but also the chilling normalcy of the Kinkle household, creating a stark contrast between the safe, suburban setting and the brutal reality that had occurred behind closed doors. Psychologists and criminologists have since examined Kip's case as an example of what has been classified as intermittent explosive disorder. In juveniles, often manifesting in predominantly white, semi-rural, middle-class communities with little prior history of violent crime and ready access to firearms. In the wake of the shooting, Kip's story became a cautionary tale for school districts and parents nationwide. Security measures, anonymous tip lines, and conflict resolution curricula were implemented in many schools to prevent similar tragedies. The case also sparked a national conversation about juvenile sentencing, gun access, and the identification of early warning signs in troubled youth. Despite these lessons, survivors and families of victims continue to live with the trauma and fear inflicted by that morning in May 1998. Kip's trial was set for September 27, 1999. As a 15-year-old, he faced charges of aggravated murder for the deaths of his parents and 2 classmates. He was sentenced to 111 years in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. While in custody, Kip continued to display the traits of a disturbed adolescent, attempting to attack an officer with a hidden knife shortly after his arrest. Reports indicated that he smuggled the knife into the police station, further reinforcing the danger he posed even in confinement. The legacy of Kip Kinkle's rampage extends beyond the courtroom. Communities across the United States, from Pearl, Mississippi, to Springfield, Oregon, re-evaluated school safety protocols, emergency preparedness, and the identification of at-risk youth. National organizations recommended after-school programs, anonymous tip lines, and conflict resolution education starting in elementary school. These measures aim to prevent other students from reaching the point of violent outburst, acknowledging the role that early intervention and vigilant oversight might play in saving lives. Survivors of the Thurston High massacre, such as Jake Riker and others who helped subdue Kip, became inadvertent heroes, embodying the courage and resilience necessary to confront acts of unthinkable violence. Case 6. Christian Michael Longo. Christian Michael Longo's story is one of deception, betrayal, and unimaginable tragedy. Born on January 23, 1974, in Ypsilanti Township, Michigan, Longo grew up in a strict Jehovah's Witness household. On the surface, he appeared polite, well-spoken, and devoted to his faith. He participated in the church's door-to-door ministry, and his upbringing seemed wholesome and structured. But behind the veneer of religiosity lay a man increasingly consumed by material desires, mounting debts, and a compulsion to maintain appearances at all costs. By the time he met Mary Jane Baker, a woman 7 years his senior, Longo had already begun showing the cracks in his moral armor. The two married when he was 19, a union that would soon be shadowed by financial strain and deceptive behavior. Longo purchased Mary Jane a 3.5-carat diamond engagement ring on a payment plan he could not afford, and when he found himself short on rent and payments, he stole money from his workplace, only to return it the next day with a letter of resignation. Church elders sanctioned him, but Mary Jane stood by him, and they eventually married. Despite this early warning sign, the Longo marriage seemed normal. They had 3 children: Zachary, 4, Sadie, 3, and Madison, 2. And outwardly, the family appeared happy. But Longo's addiction to luxury and status, coupled with mounting debts and a failing construction cleanup business, put the family under tremendous pressure. Credit cards were maxed, loans were unpaid, and the family was living a precarious existence while keeping up a facade of success for relatives and church members. Longo even manipulated his father into investing tens of thousands of dollars in his failing business, while continuing to deceive his wife and congregation. The family moved repeatedly, first to Toledo, Ohio, into a warehouse they intended to convert into a loft, living without proper kitchen or plumbing. Then to Oregon, chasing the illusion of stability. All the while, Longo continued forging checks and using stolen property to sustain the charade. By December 2001, Longo's financial world had collapsed entirely. The family had moved into a small condominium in Waldport, Oregon, but rent was unpaid, groceries were scarce, and bills were piling up. The pressure mounted, and on December 16, 2001, Longo's carefully constructed facade would give way to a horrific reality. According to his testimony, Longo spent that night contemplating his spiraling life, wine and cheese in hand, unable to sleep. Mary Jane confronted him about unpaid bills and the family van, which was stolen, and the couple argued. Longo claimed he had a moment of complete despair, leading him to commit the unthinkable. He strangled Mary Jane in a moment of rage, and then turned to his youngest child, Madison, smothering her to death as well. He placed their bodies in suitcases, later discarding them in the water behind their condominium. The other two children, Zachary and Sadie, were later found drowned in the nearby Lint Slough, weighed down with rocks, their tiny lives brutally ended. The horror of the murders sent shockwaves through Lincoln County and across the nation. Initially, police sought Longo for questioning, but he had already vanished, eventually landing on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. For weeks, he eluded authorities, traveling south to Mexico, posing as Michael Finkel, a travel writer, and mingling with tourists and locals alike. Longo's charm, intelligence, and confidence allowed him to live openly in Tulum, Mexico, even courting a young German photographer, all while the world searched for him. His capture came on January 12, 2002, when Mexican federales and FBI agents apprehended him at a beach cabana without incident. He returned to the United States, where the weight of his crimes and his own testimony would seal his fate. At trial, Longo's demeanor confounded many. His boyish looks and calm speech belied the brutality of his actions. He pleaded guilty to the murders of Mary Jane and Madison before trial, admitting his guilt voluntarily and without a plea deal. During his testimony, he claimed that his wife had killed Sadie and Zachary, a statement prosecutors immediately challenged. The jury would ultimately have to reconcile Longo's chilling narrative with the evidence presented. Prosecutors painted a picture of a calculated, cold-blooded killer who had planned the murders months in advance. Investigators discovered web searches on Hitman Online and notes alongside obituaries, suggesting Longo considered changing his identity. He isolated Mary Jane from her family and discarded personal belongings, including clothing and family photos, leaving behind a trail of deception. A critical eyewitness placed Longo on the bridge near where the older children were thrown into the water, corroborating the circumstantial evidence. The defense argued that Longo was coerced into returning from Mexico and pointed to minor inconsistencies, including questions about the identification process by the witness, suggesting bias from media saturation and prior exposure to Longo's image. They also highlighted Longo's nonviolent history, his lack of childhood aggression, and his generally compliant behavior in jail. However, the jury found the circumstantial evidence and Longo's own words overwhelmingly convincing. On April 7, 2003, Christian Longo was convicted of aggravated murder for the deaths of Zachary and Sadie. The penalty phase focused on his manipulative nature, his ability to deceive anyone he encountered, and the risk he would pose if allowed into general prison population. Despite arguments from the defense that Longo's infractions were minor and typical, the jury determined that his intelligence and sociopathic traits rendered him a continued threat. On April 16, 2003, after 6 hours of deliberation, Longo was sentenced to death for all 4 murders. Case 7. Edward. Paul Morris. On a cold December morning in 2002, Edward Paul Morris, a 37-year-old man from Portland, Oregon, seemed to be the picture of a family man. He lived with his wife, Renee, 7 months pregnant, and their 3 children, 10-year-old Bryant, 8-year-old Alexis, and 4-year-old Jonathan. Friends and neighbors described him as quiet, perhaps reserved, but capable of kindness, a husband and father dedicated to his family. No one suspected that beneath the calm exterior, Morris harbored a darkness that would erupt in one of Oregon's most chilling family murders. December 21st began like any ordinary day for the Morris family, or so it appeared. Edward announced a spontaneous trip to the Tillamook State Forest, a scenic area near the Oregon coast, seemingly intended for a day of family bonding. But as they drove along Route 6, the forest's serene backdrop became the stage for a brutal and calculated act. At a pullout in the remote area, Morris turned on his family. In a sudden, unthinkable act of violence, he shot his wife, Renee, in cold blood. His 2 sons, Bryant and Jonathan, were next. The youngest, just 4 years old, never stood a chance. The forest, quiet and snow-covered, bore witness to the unimaginable. After murdering his wife and 2 sons, Morris did not stop. He drove further into the forest to a deserted, wooded area. There, he confronted his daughter, Alexis, stabbing her repeatedly more than a dozen times until life was extinguished. The scene left hunters who discovered the bodies later that morning in stunned disbelief. The snow was marked by the tragedy of blood and innocence lost, a grotesque tableau that shook the small community and would haunt Oregon for months to come. Once the murders were committed, Morris fled the scene in the family minivan. He took drastic measures to alter his appearance, shaving his head, growing a mustache, and adopting a new persona. For 2 weeks, he became the subject of a nationwide manhunt. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, warned the public that he was armed and dangerous, issuing a $50,000 reward for information leading to his capture. Sightings were reported from as far as New Jersey, Alabama, and British Columbia, creating a tense and uncertain atmosphere across the nation. The breakthrough came on January 4, 2003, thanks to the vigilance of 2 ordinary citizens. Siblings Thomas and Linda Martin, driving near Baker City, Oregon, spotted a Dodge Caravan matching the description of Morris's van. Suspicious, they followed him and immediately called 911. Police, aware of the potential danger, strategically positioned themselves at a local pharmacy where Morris eventually entered. Within minutes, Edward Morris walked out, unarmed, unaware that his freedom was about to end. He complied calmly with officers' commands, kneeling on the ground and surrendering without resistance. His escape, 350 miles from the snow-covered Tillamook Forest, was over. Morris's arrest brought relief, but also shock. His father, Paul Morris, speaking from his Gresham home, admitted he was numb and at a loss for words. The families of the victims, however, expressed cautious relief. Renee's mother, Pat Elmore, and stepfather, Keith Elmore, along with family friend Tom Stubblefield, witnessed the end of the manhunt with emotions ranging from despair to cautious hope. After 13 days of intense searches, public tips, and countless false leads, Morris's capture finally provided some measure of closure, though it could never undo the horror of his actions. Investigators pieced together Morris's movements in the days leading up to his capture. Surveillance and witness accounts placed him in North Portland on December 19th, checking into a motel in the Dalles the next day under the alias Jim Elliott. He had paid cash and avoided showing identification, a calculated move to remain elusive. Despite reports claiming he had crossed into Washington, Morris later admitted to investigators that he had not left Oregon, though he refused to provide details of his whereabouts. Authorities worked tirelessly, following 615 tips from the public, scanning surveillance footage, and coordinating between agencies to track him down. The legal consequences of Morris's actions were swift, once he was in custody. Charged with 7 counts of aggravated murder, a reflection of Oregon law treating the killing of children under 14 as double counts, he faced the gravity of his crimes. On September 20th, 2004, he pled guilty, acknowledging responsibility for the deaths of his pregnant wife and 3 children. The court sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again pose a threat to society. The Morris case drew comparisons to similar tragedies, including the Christian Longo murders in 2001, highlighting a grim pattern of family annihilations that shock the conscience. Experts in criminal psychology examined Morris's actions, noting the sudden escalation from a seemingly ordinary family man to a parricidal murderer. Motives were speculated upon, but never fully clarified, leaving a chilling ambiguity about the psychological state that could lead a parent to kill the very children they had vowed to protect. Media coverage amplified the horror of the story. News outlets detailed the manhunt, the discovery of the bodies, and the eventual capture. Interviews with law enforcement officials emphasized both the danger posed by Morris and the pivotal role of public cooperation in apprehending him. Detective John Shepard and Sergeant Doug Schrade of the Baker City Police Department described the arrest as unusually straightforward, highlighting Morris's surprising compliance and lack of resistance during the final encounter. Tillamook County Sheriff Todd Anderson praised the Martins, underscoring how ordinary citizens can be instrumental in solving crimes that captivate national attention. While the legal system moved forward, the emotional aftermath for the Morris family and community lingered. Renee Morris's parents and extended family faced the daunting task of grieving and processing the violent loss of their loved ones. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the outward normalcy of the family with the brutality of Edward Morris's actions. The small Oregon towns where the Morris family lived and where the bodies were discovered were forever marked by the tragedy, a reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. Edward Paul Morris now serves his sentence in Oregon, a life defined by the choices that led to the destruction of his family. Though justice was served in the courtroom, the broader narrative raises profound questions about prevention, warning signs, and the psychology of parricide. His name remains a grim fixture in Oregon's criminal history, a case studied for its shocking brutality, the efficiency of law enforcement, and the crucial role ordinary citizens can play in stopping fugitives. The story of Edward Morris is a haunting illustration of how quickly a seemingly ordinary life can descend into unimaginable horror, and how the consequences of such actions ripple far beyond the immediate victims. Case 8. Jacob Tyler Roberts. On a chilly December afternoon in 2012, shoppers at the Clackamas Town Center in Portland, Oregon, went about their routine holiday errands, unaware that their ordinary day was about to descend into chaos. Among the crowds of families, teenagers, and workers, a lone figure lurked outside the south entrance of the mall, parked between a Macy's and a Chipotle. Jacob Tyler Roberts, a 22-year-old man whose outwardly ordinary life concealed a storm of inner turmoil, had stolen a Bushmaster AR-15 semi-automatic rifle from an acquaintance the day before. Dressed in tactical clothing, a load-bearing vest, and a white hockey mask, he entered the mall through a department store at around 3:25 p.m., carrying multiple fully loaded magazines. At first glance, some shoppers mistook him for a paintball player or a cosplayer, but the moment he raised the rifle, all illusions shattered. Inside the atrium, Roberts stood among the unsuspecting crowd, shouting, "I am the shooter!" and unleashed a hail of bullets across the food court. The first fatality was Stephen Forsyth, a 46-year-old father of 2 and youth sports coach, sitting at a kiosk while talking on his cell phone with his father. He was struck in the head and died instantly. Almost immediately, a stray bullet struck Cindy Ann Uwile, a 54-year-old hospice nurse and mother of 2, killing her in the midst of her shopping trip. 15-year-old Kristina Shevchenko, walking to the town center Max station with a friend, was shot in the chest but miraculously survived, managing to stagger to safety, where she received urgent medical care. In mere minutes, the mall erupted in panic, with thousands fleeing, hiding, and seeking cover as Roberts moved through the building, firing indiscriminately at anyone who crossed his path. He attempted to target 16-year-old employee Alina Pavlenko from over 100 feet away, but missed, then turned toward the JCPenney store, where his weapon jammed during a reload attempt. A concealed carry permit holder, Nick Melly, drew his Glock and aimed at Roberts, but held fire because of an innocent bystander behind the shooter, a decision that may have influenced Roberts's own actions in those final moments. Roberts fled into a back storage corridor, pointing his rifle at employee Roksang Kim, who, by chance, had been outside recycling boxes and had not heard the initial gunfire. Miraculously, Roberts did not shoot him, instead retreating downstairs where he ended his own life, leaving the mall stunned, grieving, and confused. In the immediate aftermath, first responders worked tirelessly to secure the mall and care for the injured. With approximately 10,000 people inside at the time of the shooting, the potential for mass casualties was frighteningly high. Police quickly cleared the premises, searching for hiding civilians and treating minor injuries sustained in the panic. Kristina Shevchenko, the sole survivor of the gunfire, was rushed to the hospital in serious condition, while the 2 fatalities, Forsyth and Uwila, left families and friends grappling with incomprehensible loss. Emergency services and law enforcement responded with remarkable speed. Yet even as the situation stabilized, the question that haunted authorities and the public alike was, why? Why would a young man, seemingly without motive or connection to his victims, decide to commit such an incomprehensible act of violence? It was soon established that Roberts's actions were entirely random. Investigators found no evidence of premeditated targeting. He had no personal grievances with anyone at the mall, making the shooting an unfathomable act of arbitrary terror. Jacob Tyler Roberts's background offered little explanation for the violence he unleashed. Born on March 16, 1990, he had lost his biological mother at birth and was raised by his aunt in Portland's Lentz neighborhood. He never met his father and grew up largely under the care of extended family. Academically, Roberts was unremarkable, attending Milwaukee High School for 3 years before transferring to Oregon City High School for his senior year, graduating in 2008. He briefly attended Clackamas Community College in 2009 and, in the years leading up to the shooting, worked at a gyro restaurant in downtown Portland. Friends and acquaintances described him as generally cheerful, with a good sense of humor and a penchant for joking, though in the week preceding the attack, he exhibited alarming changes. Roberts abruptly quit his job, sold his belongings, ended his relationship with his girlfriend, and allegedly planned to move to Hawaii, a plan that never materialized. Those closest to him described him as appearing numb, detached from the world around him, a shadow of the young man they had known. Social media posts offered glimpses into his personality, a self-described adrenaline junkie who liked guns, alcohol, and television shows featuring violence and crime. One photograph showed him firing a pistol at a target over a backdrop of graffiti reading, "Follow your dreams," with the word "canceled" scrawled across it. Though these details hinted at fascination with danger, they offered no concrete warning that he was preparing to commit mass murder. Law enforcement pieced together Roberts's final days through interviews and evidence collection. Authorities determined that he stole the AR-15 he used in the rampage from someone he knew, highlighting the ease with which firearms can move from one person to another. His movements within the mall, his choice of clothing and mask and his indiscriminate targeting suggested a calculated awareness of fear and chaos, though the ultimate motive remained elusive. President Barack Obama, speaking on the same day about the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, referenced Clackamas Town Center among other rampages, placing Roberts' actions within the broader national tragedy of gun violence. Police and investigators emphasized that, aside from the perpetrator's social media interests, there were no clear signs pointing toward this attack. The randomness of Roberts' actions compounded the horror. Victims had no prior connection to him, and those present had mere seconds to react to survive. Despite the terror, moments of heroism emerged amidst the chaos. Shoppers and employees worked together to help each other escape, while some medical professionals present at the mall sprang into action, tending to the wounded before emergency responders arrived. Sheriff Craig Roberts praised the collaboration and bravery of law enforcement and civilians alike, noting that the relatively low casualty count, compared to what could have been, was partially due to the composure of the shoppers, who quickly sought cover or fled. Officers arrived within minutes, deploying SWAT teams to secure the sprawling 1.4 million square foot mall and ensure that no additional threats remained. As authorities pieced together witness statements and examined the crime scene, it became clear that Roberts' killing spree was brief, intense, and ultimately self-contained, ending only with his own suicide. The investigation that followed sought to understand a senseless act that had shattered families and a community. In the weeks following the shooting, questions lingered. Ex-girlfriend Hannah Patricia Sonsburn recalled the weeks leading up to the attack, noting Roberts' sudden withdrawal and emotional detachment. Yet she remained incredulous that the man she knew could commit such an act. She described him as the opposite of violent, someone who made others laugh and feel comfortable, and she struggled to reconcile the young man she loved with the gunman who terrorized the mall. Family members, including his mother Tammy Roberts, expressed shock and confusion, unable to explain the transformation that led to that December afternoon. The Oregon City School District and former classmates echoed this sentiment, describing Roberts as quiet, polite, and unremarkable, someone who never exhibited violent tendencies during his school years. Authorities, examining every piece of evidence, concluded that the shooting was an isolated, random act with no identifiable motive, leaving only the stark reality of the lives lost and altered forever. Jacob Tyler Roberts' attack on the Clackamas Town Center remains a chilling reminder of how quickly ordinary life can be shattered by acts of violence. 2 people were killed. 1 survived a near-fatal injury, and countless others witnessed terror firsthand, carrying the psychological scars of that day. While law enforcement and emergency responders demonstrated courage and professionalism, and citizens displayed heroism in the face of fear, the fundamental question, why Roberts committed the attack, remains unanswered. His life, marked by early loss, fleeting normalcy, and a sudden descent into violence, ended in a suicide that left families, friends, and a community struggling to comprehend the randomness and brutality of his actions. The Clackamas Town Center shooting stands as a stark case study in the unpredictability of human behavior and the devastating consequences when a young man's inner turmoil erupts into violent action. Case 9. Dayton Leroy Rogers. Dayton Leroy Rogers, later infamous as the Malala Forest Killer, was born on September 30th, 1953, in Moscow, Idaho, the youngest of 3 children in a family that would eventually adopt more children, creating a chaotic household environment. His early life was marked by instability and petty criminal behavior, but even these juvenile offenses hinted at a darker, latent aggression. By 7th grade, Dayton was already pushing boundaries, shooting a BB gun at passing cars with friends, a seemingly small crime that foreshadowed the violence that would later define his adult life. His early encounters with the law, however, did little to curb his emerging obsession with power, control and sadistic fantasies. At age 18, a turning point occurred when Dayton lured his 15-year-old girlfriend into the woods near Eugene, Oregon, under the pretense of a romantic encounter. Once there, he stabbed her in the abdomen with a hunting knife, reportedly saying, "I just couldn't trust you anymore." Instantly remorseful, he bizarrely proposed marriage before driving her to the hospital, where authorities were notified. Pleading guilty to second-degree assault in February 1973, Dayton received 4 years probation, a lenient sentence considering the severity of his attack. A year later, he escalated his violent behavior, attacking 2 teenage girls with a beer bottle. Although prosecutors petitioned for revocation of his probation, the court found him not guilty by reason of insanity and committed him to the Oregon State Hospital. After his release in December 1974, he married Sherry Miller, a woman he met shortly after leaving the hospital. However, the marriage did nothing to temper his increasingly dangerous impulses. By December 1975, he raped an 18-year-old woman and was indicted in January, though he remained free pending a May trial. During that time, he assaulted 2 more teenage girls, committing 1 rape and threatening another with a knife. Claiming mental disease as a defense, he pleaded not guilty. In May, he was acquitted of the December rape, but in August, he was convicted on reduced charges of coercion and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The prosecuting attorney at the time would later refer to him as a murder case looking for a place to happen, a description that would prove eerily prescient. Rogers served 5.5 years and was paroled in January 1982, with supervision ending the following year. Despite multiple convictions and institutionalizations, his sexual sadism and violent tendencies remained unchecked, a ticking time bomb of predatory aggression. His criminal career escalated dramatically on August 6, 1987, when he murdered Jennifer Lisa Smith, a 25-year-old prostitute, in the parking lot of a Denny's restaurant in Oak Grove, Oregon. Witnesses saw him crouched over her body and gave chase, recording his license plate and truck description, allowing police to track him to his small engine repair business in Woodburn. When authorities searched his property, they found fragments of clothing and jewelry that would later be linked to other victims. The discovery of Jennifer Smith's body marked the beginning of a broader investigation that would uncover the worst serial killings in Oregon's history. On August 31st, a bow hunter stumbled across a badly decomposed body on a privately owned timber farm near Molalla, 10 miles southeast of the town. Over the next 5 days, 6 more bodies were discovered in the same area, all nude women, many showing signs of brutal torture. By September 5th, the body count had reached 7, with ages ranging from 16 to 35. Victims included Riatha Marie Giles, 16, Cynthia Dede, Diane DeVore, 21, Lisa Marie Mock, 23, Maureen Ann Hodges, 26, Nandasa Noni, Kay Cervantes, 26, Christine Lotus Adams, 35, and Jennifer Lisa Smith, 25, whose murder had already brought Dayton into custody. One additional victim was believed to have been killed by Rogers, but remained unidentified, and he was never charged in her death. Evidence from the Molalla forest site was chilling. Some victims had their feet severed, and one had been eviscerated from the vagina to the sternum, injuries suggesting they had suffered while still alive. Small orange juice containers and miniature vodka bottles littered the scene, items Rogers reportedly used during his sadistic rituals, according to surviving witnesses. His criminal record showed a consistent pattern of escalating violence, sexual predation, and manipulation. During his trials, several surviving women testified about his obsession with bondage and torture, corroborating the forensic evidence. Despite claims of self-defense in the Jennifer Smith case, where Rogers alleged she had threatened him with a knife, he was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 30 years before parole eligibility. His subsequent trial for the Malala forest killings was far less sympathetic. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who derived sexual pleasure from torturing and killing women, using his victims' fear and suffering as instruments of gratification. The jury deliberated for just over 6 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty of 13 counts of aggravated murder, resulting in a death sentence. Case 10. Sebastian Alexander Shaw. Sebastian Alexander Shaw, born Chow Quang Ho in Vietnam on November 28, 1967, would become one of the most chilling figures in the Pacific Northwest's criminal history. Shaw's crimes were marked not only by their brutality, but also by their randomness, a terrifying hallmark of a man who killed without discernible motive and who seemed capable of choosing anyone as his next victim. By the time law enforcement finally caught up to him in the late 1990s, Shaw had left a trail of murder and sexual violence across Oregon, his victims ranging from a paraplegic man to an 18-year-old woman and her companion, all selected at random, all brutally attacked. His first known victim, Jay Rickbile, 40, who suffered from cerebral palsy, became a target in July 1991, the same day Shaw was fired from his job at Paragon Cable. Fueled by rage and perhaps a sense of injustice at his termination, Shaw went on a violent rampage, entering Rickbile's Southeast Portland apartment and stabbing him repeatedly, severing his main neck artery and vein while he lay helpless in bed. This first act of violence would set the stage for a spree that law enforcement would struggle to piece together for years. By 1992, Shaw's anger at personal conflicts in his workplace would manifest again in a most unusual way. Rather than confronting his coworkers, Shaw sought out complete strangers to take his fury upon, a hallmark behavior of the unpredictable and opportunistic killer. On July 17, 1992, he entered a Southeast Portland mobile home, raping an 18-year-old woman, Donna Ferguson, and then stabbing both her and her 29-year-old companion, Todd Rudiger, to death. The randomness of the attack would become a defining characteristic of Shaw's criminal pattern. Authorities were initially baffled, unable to tie these murders to a common suspect, and the community remained unaware that a predator was loose, selecting victims at whim and leaving terror in his wake. Shaw, a Vietnamese refugee who had become a U.S. citizen by 1986, had joined the Marines, but was honorably discharged in 1990 due to being overweight, a personal setback he described as devastating in a diary later seized by police. The combination of military training and personal resentment may have contributed to his methodical approach to violence, allowing him to evade detection for years despite multiple brushes with the law. Shaw's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely, if not for the relentless work of Portland investigators who, in the late 1990s, finally connected the dots through DNA evidence. In 1998, police caught him after linking a discarded cigarette butt to the 1992 murders of Ferguson and Rudiger and the 1995 rape of a Portland woman. When Shaw was finally arrested, authorities found not only stolen property in his possession, but also a murder kit containing a ski mask, surgical gloves, duct tape, knives, binoculars, and plastic handcuffs, indicating a chilling level of premeditation and readiness for further crime. Shaw's criminal activities extended beyond Oregon. Alameda County officials began investigating his potential involvement in the 1994 murder of 14-year-old Jenny Lynn in Castro Valley, California, almost immediately after her death. At the time, he was one of over 50 suspects considered, but it was not until Shaw's arrests and convictions in Oregon that investigators could narrow their focus. The similarities between Shaw's known killings and the murder of Jenny Lynn were striking. Both involved young victims, sexual assault, and stabbing, often with victims found bound and attacked in their own homes. Jenny Lynn's murder remained unsolved for nearly 12 years, leaving her parents, John and Maylene Lynn, in agonizing limbo. John Lynn returned home on the evening of May 27, 1994, to find his daughter's body in the upstairs bathroom, naked, bound with duct tape, and stabbed multiple times. A scene of unimaginable horror that shook the tight-knit community of Castro Valley to its core. Over the following years, the Lynn family established the Jenny Lynn Foundation, keeping her memory alive and advocating for justice, while authorities methodically pieced together Shaw's pattern of violence. Interviews with Shaw in prison revealed the terrifying scope of his crimes. Retired Portland investigators Larry Findling and Michael Stallman reported that Shaw admitted responsibility for as many as 10 to 12 other killings, though he insisted he would only confess if spared the death penalties and transferred to a federal prison where he could smoke. Shaw's calculated coldness left those who interviewed him unsettled. Stallman described him as leaving a real impression of being reptilian, utterly devoid of empathy or remorse. Despite Shaw's admissions, prosecutors could not guarantee he would avoid death, leading to trials where DNA evidence became the decisive factor. In 2000, Shaw pleaded guilty to the murders of Ferguson and Rudiger and the rape, avoiding trial, but cementing his place in Oregon's criminal history. Later, DNA linked him to the murder of Jay Rickbile, leading to a third life sentence without parole.